So, does the UK have a fuel shortage at the moment? No. Well, thanks for watching the video, and if you did enjoy, then be sure to subscribe to the channel. Special thanks to our Patreon backers who... What, that's not the whole video? But Grant's chaps just said that there wasn't a fuel shortage.
The shortage of drivers is a much smaller number. So as I say, there isn't a dramatic shortage in drivers. In fact, it's been like this for a long time. Create a situation where people start to queue, other people see the queue, and on it goes.
Okay, so if there's no fuel shortage, then why are queues getting outrageous outside petrol stations? Well, I can explain that right now. If you live in the UK, you'll likely be getting increasingly used to huge lines at petrol stations and even empty pumps. So why are people so keen to fuel up that they're willing to wait in line for hours? Well, as Shaps explained a moment ago, there isn't a shortage of fuel in the UK. We do have enough petrol. The problem is actually getting it into your car. We have the supplies, we have the cars waiting up for fuel. The issue is in the middle. The trucks getting the fuel to the petrol station. That's good news, because it means the fuel does still exist, but not having it ready to pump into your car, well, that is an issue. Because it's not all that reassuring to say that it's just an issue with HGV drivers. That's like turning up at hospital for an operation and being told that they have bed space and the equipment, but no doctors. So if we have the fuel and the demand, then what's going on with the HGV drivers? Well, this is a common issue that we've actually talked about before on the channel. Britain has a serious shortage of lorry drivers, and as such, getting fuel to stations, or even food to shelves, is getting increasingly difficult. Let's take BP as an example, the fueling giant who operate and supply 1,200 petrol stations in the UK. They announced last Thursday that due to supply chain issues, they'd only be running at 80% capacity, and as such, stations will be refilled less often than normal. BP don't actually hire their own HGV drivers to supply their stations, instead outsourcing it to a company called Heuer. That meant that when Heuer had driver shortages, BP were hit hard. And despite 45 drivers currently in training for the company, BP simply don't have enough due to a high attrition rate, with more drivers leaving than joining the industry. So the issue is this middle section, the lack of HGV drivers. But what's causing this shortfall? Well, it depends who you ask. Some are blaming Brexit for the shortage. Others, including the government, insist that it isn't down to Brexit at all. Who's right? Well, we polled our audience on Twitter and found that the majority thought that Brexit was to blame, although the result was very different when you take into account how those people voted in 2016, with Brexit voters far less likely to blame the B word. By the way, you can still cast your vote by clicking the link below. But let's take a look at the claims. Those that blame Brexit say that since the UK's departure and new rules for EU workers, European drivers have left the country in droves, driving this shortage. But is that true? Well, let's ask the drivers who are leaving the market. A recent poll conducted by the Road Haulage Association asked drivers who are quitting HGV driving why they were doing so. Of those asked, nearly 60% said that Brexit was a factor. Other contentious issues like pay rates and COVID also scored highly too, but Brexit is clearly a major factor and represents tens of thousands of departures, a big part of the 90,000 driver shortfall. The government denies that this is the primary issue though, instead arguing that European countries are also experiencing similar problems, and as such, the issue can't be Brexit. In fact, Shaps even commented that being outside of the EU has given him additional powers that he wouldn't otherwise have had. So, what's the government doing with those powers? Well, over the weekend, the government agreed to issue additional visas for European HGV drivers, allowing them to return to work in the UK. Some don't like this strategy though, worrying that it will lead to other industries demanding exemptions and special treatment too. In fact, that's exactly why the government said that they wouldn't do this earlier last week, and some senior Tories, including Priti Patel, still seem to be unconvinced. Regardless, the hope is that by doing this, they'll be letting in more drivers and the issue will resolve, even if the number of visas issued doesn't even close to make up for the shortfall. And regardless, it's not exactly going to reassure many motorists. Going back to BP again, they told Reuters yesterday that a third of their stations were running on empty, and other estimates put it at more than half, which will only fuel people's fears and lead to greater demand and panic buying. So what happens next? Well, regardless of whose fault it is, Brexit, HGV drivers, COVID, pay rates, panic buyers, whatever, this issue is likely to rumble on in one form or another until new drivers get into the industry. The government's hoping that long-term, British drivers can be trained up to fill the gap, with a big emphasis being put on getting new workers into the industry. But this might be a little difficult. Remember earlier I said that 60% of drivers blamed Brexit for their decision. Well, more than 50% also blamed new changes to IR35, which impacts how drivers get paid, and nearly 50% blamed pay rates more generally. It's hardly surprising either. Being an HGV driver means long hours, being away from home, tough conditions both physically and mentally, and, well, for many the wages just don't justify those costs, with the average driver earning £32,100 a year, only 8% above the national average. It's hardly surprising then that many want out, with about 50% of departing drivers saying that they're headed towards a different industry altogether. What can be done about this long term then? Well, it seems that just training new people won't work. As with an attrition rate like this, it's not sustainable, even if you're constantly pouring in new workers. Maybe the actual answer then might be spending more on haulage, whether that goes towards improving wages or drivers' conditions to make the role actually appealing. Many companies might not like the higher costs that this leads to, and it may even trickle down to the consumer, but it seems like there are scant other options on the table. The same's happening in other industries too, with worker shortages emerging in industries like retail and hospitality. We'll have to see what's going to happen when the furlough scheme fully wraps up at the end of this month, but it seems that after 18 months of COVID, many people are increasingly unwilling to return to work if it means poor working conditions and low wages. What the government does about this is hard to guess, but ultimately it's the individual's decision whether they want to accept a job, and when it comes to drivers, it seems that more are saying no than ever. One thing you have control over, at least when it comes to the fuel shortage though, is limiting your response. If you don't need fuel immediately, or it isn't crucial to your work or life, then allowing others to refuel and driving less prevents a panic spiral where panic buying leads to fuel shortages due to hysteria rather than genuine demand. But what do you think? What can be done about the HGV shortage, and who's to blame? Have you been fueling up, or do you think that this issue is just being exacerbated by panic buying? While you're at it, get more posts like these and cast your votes in upcoming polls by following us on Instagram and Twitter. It's at TLDR News UK. Okay, so back to where we started. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified every time we release a new video. Special thanks to our Patreon backers who make videos like this one possible. And if you want to see your name at the end of videos, then you too can back us on Patreon. The link to that is in the description.